Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick too. I wanted to go over all of the Malignant Hearts with you guys and talk about which ones are particularly good for Rogue so you guys know which ones to be looking out for. I'm sorry that I don't have a build video yet. I've just been testing a whole bunch of stuff. I'll probably have one out later tonight or maybe around tomorrow. I want to get my character a bit more optimized before I do that, and I'm still in the process of testing a few things. Particularly, there's one Malignant Heart which I really wanted to make this video about to talk about. It's very, very good, but also very bad for multiple different reasons, so I'm going to go in depth with that. But first, we're going to go over all the other hearts. Briefly, I want to showcase the heart that I'm going to talk about, though, and just show that it actually is pretty good if you have really bad gear. And the damage potential is kind of insane. You can do some really funny stuff with it. So as you can see right here, I'm level 73. My gear is like complete garbage at this point. I have like 700 item power weapons. And you can get procs in the pretty high numbers, like 300, 400, 600k here. But then this next proc, I got 1.1 mil, 1.2 mil. And then I got, what did I get? 1.5 mil and 1.5 mil again. One thing that's really interesting about this is that also it scales with multiple people in your team actually dealing damage to the same enemy. So on this world boss here, I was able to hit for 15 million, but it's not my damage. It's like all the necromancers basically carrying me. Pretty funny interactions. We'll go over all of that, but first let's just talk about which ones are actually good for Rogue. So when it comes to the hearts themselves, how they function, you have 3 slots. You can only use 1 Wrathful, but the other 2, you just use whatever you happen to loot. Unfortunately, I thought I heard this in the dev live stream, maybe I misheard. I thought that you could get jewelry with a certain socket and actually re-roll what socket it had. You can't seem to do that. So if you happen to get a ring that's like perfectly rolled, but it's a vicious socket and you don't want to use a vicious gem, well, you're SOL, unfortunately. But the only limitation is you can only use 1 Wrathful heart, which are typically the better ones. If you happen to socket a Wrathful heart, you're not able to unsocket it, so it's very important to know which ones are good so you can either save them, particularly the Wrathful ones because they're pretty rare to get. You can save it for a really good piece of jewelry or something, but also the crappy ones, you can just like use a crappy roll of something, throw it in there, but you don't want to use like a perfect roll until you get like, you know, a pretty good piece of jewelry, because once you use it, it's stuck in that piece forever. I've been testing a ton of them, and I just want to go over which ones I think are good with you guys. Honestly, though, I'm extremely disappointed with the Rogue ones particularly. Let's just talk about which ones are actually good, and then I'll briefly mention why some of the other ones are bad. So when it comes to the actual good ones that you want to be looking out for, Tempting Fate is particularly good. It goes up to 80% increased critical strike damage, I think, or 90%. Depends on the item power that you get, so the item power scales up based on just, you know, where it dropped and also your current level, I believe. So this one is an 85% top end roll with the crit damage, but this one is also in tier 4, but it's an 80% top end roll, but it's 682 item power, so maybe it's not counting as ancestral or something. I don't know. Anyways, this heart is particularly good because it just gives you straight up crit damage. It is not particularly insane or anything because it is additive crit damage. So the more crit damage that you end up actually scaling up with your character, the less value that this is going to be. But because you're scaling so much crit already, you get to a point to where if you don't crit, you basically do 0 damage. So using this is still just going to net you a decent DPS increase. Using it early on when you don't have very much crit chance is probably kind of like a damage nerf, because the reduction in the damage that you deal that isn't a crit is multiplicative, where the crit damage is just additive with your overall crit damage. Ultimately, though, Rogue doesn't have a ton of good options, so this is probably one that almost every Rogue is pretty much locked into using, simply because it is damage. Another particularly good one is Heart of Revenge. It is not that good, but Rogue doesn't have a ton of good options, so I think a lot of people end up using this. Basically, 10 to 20% of incoming damage is instead suppressed, so effectively you don't take 20% of the damage that you otherwise would have taken. And then if you use a defensive or a subterfuge skill, basically only subterfuge, all that damage is then amplified by 250%, and then it explodes and deals some damage. I use this for a while actually using a subterfuge skill. In most of my builds, I don't actually use subterfuge, but I was using poison trap for a little bit just to test it out. I didn't notice it doing that much damage because I think a lot of the damage that you take is going to be reduced, right? So you then dealing that damage back, I don't think scales up very well. You mainly just use this as purely defensive. Oh, I just take less damage. Lastly, for the non-Wrathful gems, here's one that I don't necessarily think is good, but it is an option. I think Blizzard forgot to scale this one up for some reason, because as you can see, lucky hit. So first of all, the proc rate is going to be really bad because it's a lucky hit with a 20% chance to launch 5 stun grenades that deal a whopping, hold your horses guys, 31 physical damage. So that's cool, and it stuns enemies for half a second. So yeah, I don't have much to say about this. It procs a decent bit, like every once in a while you'll get this, but the proc rate is half a second So my only like hope for this was using it with exposure and making grenades count as trap skills and try to get more CDR with exposure. But the proc rate is just bad. Half a second stun, like it's decent utility. If you play with it, you'll see that it does proc. But half a second stun, I mean, something needs to scale up here. I would call it mediocre. Like you can use it just because you have 3 slots and you don't have many other options that are particularly good. One that I actually think is particularly good, I forgot to mention this one, is the Cage Heart of Trickery. Whenever you use a subterfuge skill such as like Poison Trap, Concealment, Smoke Grenade, or Dark Shroud, you will just pop down a Shadow Decoy that actually taunts enemies. The taunt is pretty good. The enemies will kind of like focus the Shadow Clone. They'll come in a little bit closer sometimes. It's pretty nice. The damage that it deals is really bad because it's after 6 seconds, so the damage portion of this is not particularly helpful. However, the decoy portion, actually taunting mobs, is very good, especially for Rogue because our survivability can be a little rough sometimes. The problem with this is that the conditional is you have to use a subterfuge skill. Personally, I don't really like using subterfuge skills in my builds. I don't think they are all that necessary when you're doing a lot of easier speed farming type content. But this is going to be particularly good when you're like trying to do something hard, such as like a capstone very underleveled, or you're trying to do higher nightmare dungeons. I think this is actually a pretty decent example of a well-designed heart. Now I'm going to talk about some of the bad hearts and why they're bad and kind of go on a rant, but if you only care about the good ones, just skip to the Wrathful section of the video, which I will have timestamped. So this is a good example of a good designed heart that I think is pretty good, changes how you play a little bit, overall nice. Now we have an example of probably the worst heart that is in the game, Cage Heart of the Clip Shot. Lucky hit, so low chance of proc. 40% chance for your Cutthroat skills to slow enemies. We don't take advantage of slow in any meaningful capacity. The only thing this would do is like we get another CC for Umbral, but you could literally use Lucky Hit chance of slow on your gloves as like a normal affix roll already. So this is just terrible. And if you're using a marksman skill, it knocks back enemies. So you think, okay, maybe the knockback is good for marksman skill, but it kind of has an anti-synergy where if you're using puncture, you're throwing out your punctures trying to get combo points with your marksman skills, and the mobs are getting knocked back into oblivion, and like all the mobs are super separated, and it's just a nightmare to play with, especially because a lot of the marksman skills are very particularly, like they have AoE problems, not single target problems. So when you spread all the mobs out, it just makes the build significantly harder to play with, and it's just not worth your slot. So that's really bad. The cluster munitions I kind of already talked about. Decoy is pretty good, and then I'll talk about the Wrathful one in a bit. When it comes to the rest of the general ones, I'll briefly touch on why they're bad. This one just doesn't do enough damage at all. The Dark Dance one I thought was actually going to be pretty good. The life cost doesn't seem to scale up very much. It's only at like 200 life right now in my current character with a pretty good roll. The problem with this though is that it only works for one core skill cast. So every 5 seconds, while you have above a certain life threshold, one of your core skill casts will do like 26% increased damage. So net, like overall, your net increased damage is extremely low with this. I just wouldn't recommend using it. It simply just is not worth a slot. It's a little bit of extra damage technically, but I mean, it's overall really bad. We already talked about the crit damage one. Buried Generation, people ask me if this is going to be good with using like Temerity or something. Temerity is just not worth it because you just nerf your survivability into the ground, not having the damage reduction on your pants there. So Barrier Gen, a tiny HPS, like not worth it. Revenge, I already talked about, decent for the survivability. Prudent Heart, getting immunity. It has just way too much of a cooldown and you'll just proc it instantly, so not worth it in my opinion. Determination is really bad because the resource generation does not scale up past 8%, and you don't have to deal with any resource draining effects. I don't really know what this is for other than resource burn keys, which you don't enter in the first place. So don't know what this is for. Retaliation, dealing damage when you get crowd control, that's bad. After spending a resource, your next attack will stun. This is okay. The problem with Rogue is that if you have Inner Sight up, it doesn't count as you spending resource because it costs 0 because you have infinite resource. And also, this cost doesn't really scale down. So you'd have to press, like, I don't know, like 5 Twisting Blades or something to get 1 Twisting Blade to then stun enemies for 4 seconds. It's okay for CC. I don't think this is necessarily that bad, but I don't really see you using it in a slot. Every once in a while you get a stun. Not too bad though, maybe good for like higher nightmare dungeons. Hello kitty. That's it for all of those. Now let's talk about the Wrathful ones, which again you can only use one of. So Rogue actually has 4 Wrathful options, 3 that are generic, and 3 of the generic ones are actually particularly nice. So the first one we want to talk about is the Heart of the Malignant Pact. This one you can get very early on, does not have a World Tier requirement. Heart of the Barber has a World Tier 3 requirement, which we'll talk about. This one is good. It just like passive buffs that are good. It's not anything crazy. Like you get 20% attack speed. It doesn't seem to scale up. I think you get a 24% at a max roll. Could be wrong. And the core and basic skills, chance to fully restore resource, I did not see that scale up either. Every 20 kills, it's going to swap. I've not personally played with this. I've tried a lot. I farmed a Malignant Tunnel for like 4 hours. I couldn't get this one. I've looted the other Wrathfuls a bajillion times, and for some reason, I can't get this one. Unfortunately, the barrier effect of this is pretty bad, but I mean, getting attack speed and getting some chance to restore resource is okay. Inner Sight seems to have a little bit of a bug right now, so this just helps you with your overall resource gen. But once you have like a perfectly set up build, you have a good rolled Umbral, resource is probably not an issue anymore, in which case you just don't want to use this, and you can only use one Wrathful slot. So it's good early on, but it ends up not being that great. Cage Heart of Creeping Death is very, very good, but also bad at the same time. Basically, your damage over time effects do increased damage for each different crowd control on the target. You can apply multiple different crowd controls, such as like Poison Trap Knockdown, Daze with Manglers, and then Daze into a knockdown. You can do Stun with like Shadow Step or Exposure. You can do Chill with Penitent Greaves, other stuff. But the only thing that this really affects damage-wise is going to be Poison Imbuement. So you could scale up Poison Imbuement pretty good. However, if you're trying to like speed farm, you don't want your Poison Imbuement to be killing everything. You don't want to be fighting a target, applying all this different CC to be able to kill them. You want to look at the mob and have them instantly die, right? So this is really good if you're fighting like bosses or something. Like Lilith is going to get absolutely annihilated with this. And it's going to be good for like just end of dungeon bosses or like fighting the Butcher or something. And it's also going to be good for really high Nightmare dungeons where the mobs are very tanky. Or if you're super underleveled, this is also a really good option if you want to build into poison and doing a lot of damage with poison. But if you're trying to speed farm, building into damage over time is not a good idea when you're speed farming, because you just want the dungeon to be over. You don't want to be, building into this. I may end up using it once I take off the Barber though, simply just to do more damage against bosses, because 134% increased damage over time effects against bosses is pretty good if you're scaling Poison Imbuement. Talk about Barber in a bit. Lastly, talk about the rogue-specific Wrathful, which I was extremely excited for and I thought was going to be very good. The problem with this, basically, your attacks have a 15% chance to apply all imbuement effects. If you get a max roll of this, which I have a screenshot of here, the chance for this to happen does not actually scale up. The only thing that scales up is the effect of the imbuement. So 15% chance for your Twisting Blades to apply this. 1 in every 7 Twisting Blades is going to give you all imbuement effects. That's not too much value. The best value you're getting out of that is like free Shadow Imbuement to just help you clear. Getting a little bit of damage over time, a little bit of chill isn't really going to help that much. If you were actually having a significantly higher likelihood of this, you'd maybe actually want to build into a little bit of poison, a little bit of chill, because you're proccing all of them constantly. The fact that the chance stays at 15% just means that it is not nearly consistent enough for you to actually care to build into it. And it is a Wrathful slot, right? And a Wrathful slot has the damage over time stuff. It has the other thing. So yeah, I'm really sad with this. I thought it was actually going to be really good. I was super excited to see, you do one attack and boom, all 3 imbuments pop. But ultimately, I just don't really think it's going to end up being worth it, because the chance for it to proc is pretty low. And lastly, we have the Cage Heart of the Barber, which is the main reason that I wanted to make this video. I got to World Tier 4 very early, like level 57, and I was having a very hard time literally killing anything because the mobs are like level 75. I got this. I was like, okay, I want to try it out. I put it on, and boom, I was instantly able to actually play the game, and it single-handedly carried me a lot. Later on, I don't think you're going to be playing with this anymore, and I'll talk about the multiple downsides that it does have, but it is particularly good for multiple different reasons. Basically, the way that it functions is critical strikes. So once you get a critical strike, it will then basically make the mob immune, and then any damage that you deal while it is like immune is going to just basically be stacked up and absorbed all at the same time, and then that damage is going to explode outwardly to all of the targets. So it basically is just absorbing all the damage that you otherwise would have done, and then it is converting that damage into a guaranteed crit, which is going to just explode. That stored damage over time is going to be increased by 14% per second. So I've been playing with a 2.5 roll, so effectively this is just like a 35% damage increase for me almost all the time, just because of the stored damage portion of this. But it also is basically converting all of my single target damage into AoE damage, which is pretty good. I'll show you guys a couple clips of it just so you can see what it looks like. I'm level 64 doing some Nightmare dungeons here, level 76. I single-handedly used this thing and took full advantage of it to carry me. Obviously I'm not doing like insane damage, but you can see that when I go in here, basically I instantly I'm able to apply exploits, and I do a little bit of damage, but you can't see any crit damage numbers anymore because the second that you crit, boom, you apply the like literal effect of the stored damage. So now all the damage I'm going to deal is going to say immune on this guy, and he's not going to like take any hits, but every second that I'm doing damage is just constantly stacking up more and more, and then every 2.5 seconds, it's going to blow up and deal a little bit of damage. So that blow up wasn't very good because there's a damage reduction thing here. But then as you can see, I got a blow up, and boom, it's just going to deal damage to everything. And then I got one that wasn't damage reduction, and then their damage was pretty decent there. Obviously, I'm only level 64, and my character kind of sucks here. And the single target damage can be a little bit rough every once in a while, but as you can see, like 100k damage isn't too bad for my current level. And then one thing is that it actually works with your friend's damage as well. So my friend Dragon Shark comes in here, Necromancer goes burr, he comes in, starts blasting, and as you can see, 400k. That's how I was able to get 15 million earlier on the world boss. He comes in here, he's just blasting the mobs, and it stores his damage as well, which can be kind of griefing for multiple reasons, which I will kind of briefly mention. But one thing I want to show is just a little bit more gameplay of it. He's actually not here yet, so I do a little bit of damage that is decent without him, and it works very, very well with pull effects. So this is why I've been using Death Trap the whole time, because if you effectively get a whole bunch of AoE just by dealing damage to enemies, the best thing that you want to do is pull them together. So playing with a Necro, playing with a Sork is really, really good. But as you can see, I just start blasting this one mob here, getting a whole bunch of like stacked up damage on him. And then my friend is going to Corpse Tendrils, are going to pull everything together. And then because he's dealing damage and I'm dealing damage, it's storing all that damage. And then we just get these massive blowups that literally just nuked the entire pack. Ultimately, I think that this is pretty good if you have very weak damage, and I think that you want a roll that is as low to 2 seconds as possible, or as close to 2 seconds as possible. If you want to do the maximum amount of damage and you're trying to like do very high nightmare dungeons, it's possible that you end up wanting a higher roll than this. There's multiple problems with this though. First off, because of the way that the damage is stored in this very short window, you want to use something that is as much burst damage as humanly possible, which means that using something like combo points is very bad, because with combo points, you're going to use 3 punctures and then your core skill. Using the 3 punctures is going to basically proc the crit, and then it's going to start the damage immune, soak effect. And then if you try to do damage within that window, you're only going to be able to do like 1 or 2 twisting blades in that window, and a lot of the damage that you're doing is puncture. So basically your goal is to just do a whole bunch of burst damage very, very quickly with something like twisting blades and inner sight. Inner sight, however, because the mob actually counts as immune, dealing any damage while they are immune does not count as an attack. So inner sight works terribly with this because it's only going to proc when every 2.5 seconds when you actually deal damage. So it's very difficult to get a lot of your damage up. I also have tested extensively with Poison Imbuement whether or not it actually works properly. Basically, Poison Imbuement, I'm pretty sure, does work when you're using this, but it is not worth it because it only is going to soak up the damage that you would have done within that like 2.5 seconds or whatever. And Poison Imbuement does its damage over 5 seconds. So you're basically getting like less than half of the value. If you had like a max rolled 4-second one of these, which I wouldn't recommend because it's going to slow down your clear time a lot, you could end up using the Poison Imbuement. But ultimately, I've been using Cold Imbuement, which just increased damage because basically you want to do as much burst damage as humanly possible to get as much value within that very short window, which I found Cold Imbuement to be pretty decent for, even though I don't typically really like using Cold Imbuement. Because of this immunity, this also poses a couple other problems for us, which is why I don't think you will end up using this later into the game, but it is very good early on when your character sucks. So ultimately, I'd recommend just trying it out. But this immunity poses other problems, which is mainly vulnerable application. So with Puncture, this is our main vulnerable. With Rogue, you could also use like Blast Trap with a trap or something. But because the mob counts as immune, if you try to use a Puncture while they're immune, it's not counting as you dealing any damage or hitting the enemy, even though it is still soaking the damage. You're not able to apply a vulnerable again. So basically, you need to kill enemies within an exploit window, within this like 2 seconds or 3 seconds of exploit. Otherwise, they probably aren't going to die. You can reapply vulnerable the second that the explosion happens. Like once the explosion happens, then they aren't vulnerable anymore until you get another, or they're not immune anymore until you get another crit. So you could see that the explosion happens and then apply vulnerable again. You could also try to get like aspect of shared misery, so that enemies that are just coming in, you maybe have a quick chance to like hit them with an exploit, and then that gets spread to the other enemies that maybe are immune. But not having vulnerable massively nerfs your damage, which is a problem very often that I see, which basically leads to you doing very, very weak single target damage because poison doesn't work very well with it, inner sight doesn't work very well with it, And also, any sort of lucky hit effects aren't going to work very well either, because you're not dealing a whole bunch of separate instances of damage, you're just doing one big instance of damage at once. So using something like Mangler or using even like Exposure doesn't seem that good, but it does seem like the hit that you do is going to be a guaranteed lucky hit. So you still get some value, but the value is severely diminished. Another thing that I've noticed is that it is a guaranteed critical strike every single time that it deals damage. I think that is just because you're doing so many instances of damage that it wants to show you a crit rather than just showing you a white number. So it's good to know that the effect can still crit. I don't exactly know how it works with like damage over time stuff, how it works with if you are critting, do you gain more value, how that scales up with crit damage, if that individual hit scales up with crit damage, or the only thing that scales up is just the damage that you're dealing. It's a very weird mechanic to test, and people that are way smarter than me will figure that out, and it is just too hard for me to test. I'm not smart enough to figure it out. All I know is that I've been using this. It's been carrying me. I'd highly recommend using it, trying to get a roll as low as 2 seconds or as just low as humanly possible, and just trying it out and seeing how it helps you. It helped me immensely. I was able to do nightmare dungeons at like level 60 that were level 75 monsters. Without this, I simply just couldn't do it. But ultimately, I think later into the game, once you have better gear, you're going to end up taking it off and swapping to like the creeping death thing or swapping to the cycling thing. As a very brief TLDR for those of you that were just skipping to the end of the video because you don't want to watch me talk for 20 minutes. Creeping Death is good if you're using poison imbuements and you're trying to deal damage against very tanky elites or bosses, but for speed farming, the value is pretty low. Malignant Pact is decent. Overall, just gives you a nice buff that is good, but it is not anything insane. You can only use one Wrathful though, so generally for most people, I'd recommend Malignant Pact. Barber is fantastic if you are under-geared, under-leveled, and you need a whole bunch of extra damage. This carries you. The damage interactions, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it is very, very strong just from me playing with it, although it does have some downsides as the mobs become immune, which then makes certain mechanics just not function properly, such as vulnerable application, damage over time effects, and proccing inner sight or any sort of lucky hit effect. For some of the general heart effects, using Tempting Fate is pretty much a must all the time because it is just simply extra damage. Outside of that, Cage Heart of Revenge is particularly good because it just is a 20% damage reduction effectively, but it's better than that because 20% of damage that you otherwise would have taken, you just don't actually take at all, rather than it being reduced. So this is pretty good for survivability, and Rogue doesn't have a lot of good options, so I would recommend that overall. Cluster munitions, low chance, the stun effect does not scale up, the damage doesn't even scale up. Pretty terrible item. Trickery, very good if you're using a subterfuge skill. The taunt is fantastic. Personally, I don't like using subterfuge skills, but if you do use one, I would say this is a must-have almost all the time. Clipshot is hilariously bad, probably the single worst heart in the game. Maybe, I mean, it's definitely worse than Cluster Munitions. Cluster Munitions is pretty bad, though. Vile Apothecary, I was super excited for this. Ended up just not being good because the chance for it to proc is only 15% chance. However, I don't exactly know how it works because it says your attacks have a chance. So maybe if we're lucky, it works on multiple hits of something rather than your individual, like you pressing the skill, in which case it would be actually really strong. But the fact that you have to do like 7 casts of Twisting Blades to probably get a proc of this means that it ultimately is just not worth your Wrathful slot. Anyways, that's it for the video. Build video will be posted soon. Hopefully you guys ended up learning something. If you did, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Sorry for the video being long. I just wanted to go into pretty decent detail about these things and also just complain about the fact that a lot of the hearts are not very good, and also the Barber heart is very good but also bad, and it's just a super interesting mechanic that I kind of wanted to touch with you guys so you guys exactly know what you're getting yourself into if you use this, but I would honestly just recommend everybody try it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.